The moment the phrase, "it's over," began circulating, it wasn't coming from tabloids or online commentators. It was coming from inside royal circles, where language is usually measured, cautious, and deliberately restrained. That alone changed the tone of everything. What followed was not a dramatic announcement or a public confrontation, but something far colder and far more destabilizing. Silence, followed by documentation. For years, speculation around Archie and Lilibet existed at the edges of conversation, dismissed publicly as conspiracy, while quietly discussed in private. What has shifted now is not gossip, but process. The palace, an institution built on records, lineage, and verification, does not move unless something forces its hand. And according to multiple insiders, that pressure has arrived in the form of evidence that can no longer be contained behind closed doors. Harry and Meghan, sources say, were not warned in advance. There was no courtesy briefing, no opportunity to shape the narrative, no soft rollout. The palace's approach this time has been described as procedural rather than emotional. That distinction matters. Emotional responses can be challenged, procedures cannot. When lineage is involved, especially succession, the standards are unforgiving. Either documentation aligns or it doesn't. And once discrepancies emerge, silence is no longer protection. It becomes liability. That is the space this story has now entered. For years, the Sussex narrative relied on distance. Distance from the palace, distance from protocol, distance from scrutiny. Privacy was the shield, and for a time, it worked. The public accepted that modern royals might do things differently, but difference only stretches so far before it collides with constitutional reality. Succession is not symbolic, it is legal. It is governed by rules that predate modern media cycles and personal branding, and those rules do not bend for optics. They require verification, witnesses, and biological clarity. According to those familiar with the current situation, that clarity is now being formally examined. What makes this moment uniquely destabilizing is the reported involvement of genetic confirmation. DNA is not narrative. It does not care about intent, context, or explanation. It either aligns or it doesn't. Palace insiders stress that no public accusations have been made, but internal reviews are underway, and that alone signals gravity. Institutions do not initiate such reviews lightly, especially when children are involved. The stakes are too high, the consequences too permanent. Which raises the question many are now asking quietly. If everything was as presented, why is this process necessary at all? Harry and Meghan's reported reaction has been described as stunned rather than defiant. There have been no preemptive statements, no legal threats, no counter-narrative offered. That absence is being read not as strategy, but as shock. For a couple that has historically responded quickly and forcefully to perceived slights, the silence is notable. It suggests that whatever is unfolding was not anticipated and cannot be easily reframed. This is not about public opinion. It is about records, legitimacy, and the quiet machinery of an institution that moves slowly but decisively once engaged. When the palace stops managing perception and starts examining proof, the conversation changes permanently. And once that threshold is crossed, there is no returning to how things were before. The palace's internal review did not begin with headlines or leaks. It began the way institutions protect themselves, quietly, methodically, and without commentary. According to sources familiar with the process, a discrepancy triggered the first inquiry. Not a rumor, not an online theory, but a procedural inconsistency that could not be reconciled with existing documentation. Once that happens, protocol requires escalation. Files are reviewed, timelines compared, and confirmations requested. This is not about belief, it is about alignment.
What reportedly raised concern was not a single moment, but a sequence of irregularities that only become visible when records are examined side by side. Birth notices, medical confirmations, witness statements, and hospital procedures are designed to overlap. When they don't, questions follow. According to insiders, attempts were made to resolve these inconsistencies informally. Clarifications were sought, explanations requested. The responses, however, did not fully satisfy the required standards. That is when the review shifted from administrative to formal. At that stage, the matter is no longer discretionary. Once a formal review is initiated, it must follow through. This is where genetic verification enters the picture. DNA is not accusation, it is confirmation. In cases involving succession, it serves a single purpose: to establish biological lineage beyond dispute. According to multiple accounts, this step was not demanded lightly. It was considered necessary only after other avenues failed to resolve outstanding questions. Harry and Meghan, sources say, were informed after the process was already underway. That timing matters. It removed the possibility of preemptive control. There was no space to negotiate framing or delay outcomes. The request was procedural, not optional. Provide verification, allow confirmation, close the record. The absence of an immediate response is what has fueled speculation. In situations where compliance would end doubt, hesitation speaks loudly. Meanwhile, the palace has remained outwardly silent. No statements, no denials, no affirmations. This silence is deliberate. Institutions do not comment while verification is active. Doing so risks contamination. But behind the scenes, preparations are reportedly underway for multiple outcomes. Because once evidence is reviewed, consequences follow. Titles, status, and legal positions are not emotional decisions. They are administrative ones. The gravity of this moment lies in its irreversibility. Once lineage is examined at this level, the result becomes permanent. There is no second chance to explain inconsistencies, no opportunity to reframe timelines. The process concludes, and the record is amended accordingly. That is why this development has left Harry and Meghan reportedly speechless. The story they relied on for years is no longer theirs to manage. It now belongs to documentation, to evidence, and to an institution that does not reverse itself. And once that threshold is crossed, speculation ends and certainty begins, leaving no room for spin, sentiment, or selective memory. Only the cold, permanent clarity of record, lineage, and consequence, reshaping narratives that once depended on silence, distance, and control, now replaced by verification that cannot be negotiated, delayed, or undone, regardless of status, sympathy, or strategy moving forward from here.
What happens next is where the story shifts from mystery to mechanism. When an institution like the palace initiates verification, it does not act emotionally or theatrically. It follows process. According to those familiar with how these matters unfold, once genetic material is submitted, it is handled through independent channels designed to remove bias entirely. Third-party laboratories, sealed chains of custody, and legally witnessed procedures ensure that no single actor controls the outcome. This is not a test conducted for optics, it is conducted for record. This is why the idea of proof changes everything. For years, the narrative surrounding Archie and Lilibet existed in a space shaped by appearances, carefully managed privacy, and selective disclosure. That space allowed doubt and defense to coexist, but DNA does not exist in that space. It does not respond to statements or sentiment. It either aligns or it does not, and alignment is binary. There is no partial confirmation. Sources suggest this is precisely why tension has escalated behind the scenes, because if confirmation aligns fully, the matter closes quietly, but if it does not, the implications extend far beyond embarrassment. Questions of status, titles, and historical record come into play. This is not about punishment, it is about correction. Institutions built on lineage cannot carry unresolved discrepancies forward. They must resolve them or remove them.
What makes this moment unprecedented is not the existence of testing, but the visibility surrounding it. In previous eras, such matters were resolved privately, long before public narratives formed. Here, the story has already lived publicly for years. Images, interviews, documentaries, and carefully framed moments have created a version of reality millions have accepted. If evidence now contradicts that version, the correction will not be subtle. It will ripple outward, reshaping how past events are understood. This is where silence becomes telling. Public denials are easy, legal challenges are common, but compliance followed by quiet is the fastest way to end doubt. According to observers, that has not yet happened. Instead, there has been hesitation, consultation, and reported concern about exposure rather than relief at resolution. In crisis analysis, that pattern is significant. People confident in verification tend to welcome it. Those reliant on narrative tend to resist it. Meanwhile, attention has turned toward the children themselves, not as symbols, not as leverage, but as individuals whose identities deserve clarity. This is where public sentiment becomes complicated. Sympathy does not disappear, but it shifts. The focus moves away from spectacle and toward accountability, because children should never be placed at the center of uncertainty created by adult decisions. If proof confirms the established story, critics will fall silent. If it does not, silence will move elsewhere. Either way, the outcome will close a chapter that has remained open far too long. The difference is that once documentation replaces storytelling, the conversation changes permanently. What follows is no longer debate, but adjustment. And adjustment, when it comes from an institution like the palace, is decisive, enduring, and immune to reversal, leaving history rewritten not by rumor, but by confirmation, resolution, and finality.
By the time institutions move, narratives have already done their work. That is why the aftermath matters more than the reveal. If confirmation aligns, attention will pivot to why the issue consumed so much oxygen for so long. If it does not, the focus will shift to how systems responded once doubt became unavoidable. Either way, the story ceases to belong to commentators and returns to process. Behind closed doors, process is quiet but relentless. Files are reviewed, statements are cross-checked, timelines are reconciled. What once seemed like harmless inconsistencies become reference points. In such moments, credibility is not restored through emotion, it is restored through correction. That correction can take many forms: clarifications, amendments, or reclassifications that appear administrative but carry lasting consequence. For the couple at the center, the pressure is not public outrage, it is permanence. Public storms pass, records remain. Once something is entered into the historical ledger, it cannot be edited by interviews or reframed by sympathy. This is why advisors often recommend restraint. Speaking too much freezes positions that might otherwise soften. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be strategic. Silence, when imposed, can be revealing. Observers have noted how quickly allies recalibrate when verification enters the picture. Language becomes careful, support turns conditional. Even critics adjust, shifting from accusation to analysis. That change signals a collective understanding that outcomes are approaching. Speculation loses value when answers are imminent. Attention narrows, the noise thins. There is also the institutional perspective. The palace does not act to satisfy curiosity, it acts to preserve continuity. Continuity depends on clarity. When clarity is missing, authority erodes. That erosion is subtle at first, then sudden. Restoring it requires decisions that prioritize the structure over individuals. History shows that when forced to choose, institutions choose themselves. What makes this moment resonate is how modern visibility collides with ancient protocol. Social media amplifies doubt instantly, while protocol resolves it slowly. The gap between those speeds creates friction.
In that friction, trust either hardens or breaks. The resolution will indicate which occurred here. Ultimately, this is not a story about spectacle, it is a story about boundaries, where privacy ends and verification begins, where narrative stops and record starts. When those lines blur, confusion follows. When they are redrawn, clarity returns, even if it is uncomfortable. And once clarity arrives, the story does not continue forward. It settles backward, recontextualizing everything that came before, leaving audiences not with shock, but with understanding that some chapters close not with drama, but with documentation. This closure, however, does not erase consequences, because memory persists beyond paperwork. Public trust recalibrates slowly, influenced by how transparently outcomes are communicated and whether accountability feels proportional. For some, resolution will feel vindicating. For others, it will feel unsettling. Yet institutions accept that discomfort as the price of stability, preferring firm ground over applause, certainty over sentiment, and records over stories. Knowing time ultimately favors verified truth when disputes end and governance quietly resumes, unchanged, measured, procedural, enduring.
Closure does not mean disappearance, it means recalibration. Once verification is finalized, the narrative energy drains away, and what remains is consequence, not spectacle, not outrage, but adjustment. Titles are contextualized, statements are footnoted, and future references are framed with precision rather than assumption. This is how institutions survive storms. They do not chase the noise, they annotate it, then move forward. For the public, the emotional arc shifts as well. Certainty replaces suspicion, and with it comes fatigue. Years of debate compress into a single conclusion, leaving many to realize the intensity was never sustainable. Attention drifts to new stories, but the residue remains in how credibility is assigned going forward. Trust, once questioned, is never granted automatically again. It becomes conditional, earned through consistency rather than imagery. Those closest to the center face a different reckoning. Private decisions made under pressure echo longer than anticipated when documentation enters the record. What once felt manageable through messaging becomes immovable through evidence. Advisors change. Strategies soften. The emphasis moves from persuasion to coexistence, with outcomes that cannot be reversed. In that environment, silence is no longer a shield, it is simply the absence of leverage. For the children, the conclusion matters most quietly. Clarity removes the burden of speculation from their future. Whatever the outcome, certainty allows identity to stand without commentary. That alone is why verification, however uncomfortable, is necessary. Ambiguity is a weight no child should inherit because adults preferred narrative over resolution. History will file this chapter not under scandal, but under correction. Institutions rarely announce such moments with drama. They update, confirm, and proceed. The world interprets the shift after the fact, noticing how language subtly changes, how references become careful, how assumptions disappear from official contexts. That quiet transition is the signal that the matter is settled. What remains is a lesson repeated across generations. Image can travel quickly, but record travels forever. Stories persuade, but documentation decides. When the two collide, the latter prevails, not because it is louder, but because it endures. This is why endings like this feel anticlimactic. There is no final speech, no cinematic reveal, only alignment. And alignment, once achieved, leaves little room for argument. It closes doors gently but permanently, replacing speculation with structure. The chapter ends not with applause or condemnation, but with order restored. The institution continues, the individuals adapt, the audience moves on, and the story, once consuming, becomes a reference point, resolved, contained, and ultimately smaller than it once seemed, because truth, when verified, rarely needs embellishment to stand.
This final quiet is often misunderstood as avoidance, but it is discipline. By letting records speak, institutions avoid escalation and allow time to normalize outcomes. Public memory fades faster than documentation, yet documentation guides future decisions silently. In years ahead, references will be precise, footnotes clear, and the matter closed, not forgotten, but integrated as a resolved precedent shaping governance without revisiting emotion or spectacle again. Quietly, patiently, conclusively, permanently, officially, procedurally, historically, institutionally, finished.